my son-in-law's fist slammed into my jaw, and my own daughter dragged me outside by my gray hair. All because I refused to hand over $5 million. I sat on the cold sidewalk, lip bleeding, body shaking, wondering when my sweet girl turned into a stranger. But what they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this day. And in just 2 hours their whole world would start to fall apart. I'll tell you everything. But first, thank you for watching The Voice Inside. Please subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We might give you a shout out in our next video. Today's goes to Lisa Carter from Jackson, Mississippi. Thank you for being part of our family. Now, here's what happened. I moved in with my daughter Sarah when I turned 68. Not because I was sick or couldn't care for myself, but because she begged me. She said she missed our long talks, said her husband Daniel wanted me there too. Back then I thought it was love. I didn't realize it was a trap. Their house was on a busy street in Seattle with a tiny garden and a red door that always stayed locked. Sarah had fixed up the spare room with yellow walls and white curtains, colors I'd always loved. She even put fresh flowers on the dresser and a wedding photo of us on the table. Standing there with my old suitcase, I thought, maybe this will work. Maybe we can be close again. It wasn't like I needed to move in. I still had my own little house across town, my mornings in the kitchen, my job at the flower shop downtown. That place made me happy, helping people choose bouquets, keeping my teacup collection safe. But Sarah said she wanted to cook dinner together again. Said her boys should really know their grandmother. And I believed her. At first everything seemed nice. She made me breakfast, Daniel asked about my work, and the grandkids curled up while I read them stories. I felt silly for worrying. But slowly things changed. Sarah kept bringing up money, house payments, college funds, how hard life was getting. Daniel mentioned some big investment with a friend, promising quick profits. He said it casually, cutting into his steak. I smiled, but something in my stomach turned cold. A week later, Sarah came into my room with a thick folder. Inside were bank papers, forms to sign, and even a copy of my savings account. She said they just needed a loan, promised they'd pay it back soon, said it was for the kids' future. I asked how she got my bank info. She smiled, but her eyes looked icy and said she had always known my passwords, just to check on me. That night, lying under the ceiling fan, I thought of my late husband and how we'd saved every penny carefully. I remembered the time I gave Sarah $5,000 for her car and she never paid me back. Suddenly, love felt like it had a price tag. After that, I started locking my bedroom door. By the 3rd week, they weren't even pretending anymore. I saw it first with groceries. I'd always offered to pay for my milk, bread, or herbal tea. But one day Sarah left a receipt on the counter, circling my items in red pen with a note. Your part. Pay up. No please, no hello, just a number. That evening she gave me a sheet listing all the house bills, my name written at the bottom. She said calmly, being fair keeps families strong. Daniel just nodded at his phone. I didn't argue. I carried the paper upstairs, sat on my bed and stared at the numbers. The amount wasn't unbearable, but the message was. They didn't want a mother living with them. They wanted a tenant. A few days later I walked into the garage and found Daniel with a small notebook. He snapped it shut as soon as he saw me, smiling like nothing was wrong. That night, while they were out, I checked the drawer where I kept my important papers. Everything had been moved. Some folders were out of place. Some papers were missing. I didn't need proof to know exactly what was happening. I had lived long enough to trust my instincts. Something bad was happening behind my back. At breakfast the next morning, Sarah started talking about how older folks need to plan for the day they can't care for themselves. She asked if I'd thought about making my money easier to manage. She said shared accounts were safer for emergencies, then told me about her friend's mom who had given everything to her kids early so there wouldn't be problems later. I stayed quiet. She kept talking, saying it wasn't about money, it was about peace of mind, about being ready for the future. Daniel added that he could handle the paperwork, said he'd done it for other people, even had the forms ready. I just stared at my cereal. The milk was warm. The spoon felt heavy in my hand. That afternoon I sat in my car and called the bank. I told them to watch my accounts closely, block any changes I didn't make, and alert me if anyone tried to access my money from another computer. When the banker asked if something was wrong, I simply said I was being careful. By the end of the week, Sarah handed me a stack of papers. She said they were just forms to transfer my money, to get started. Her voice was casual, like she was offering me a cookie, but her eyes didn't blink. I set the papers aside and asked about the kids. She let it go, but 2 days later Daniel brought it up again. We were alone in the basement when he said Sarah was only trying to help, that I was lucky to have a daughter who cared. Then he smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said money only causes trouble when people hide things. I walked right past him upstairs and locked my door. That night I checked every account, changed all my passwords and wrote down the names of people I could truly trust. I scanned my important papers and tucked them into a hidden pocket of my suitcase. I didn't sleep much. I wasn't terrified yet, but I was preparing. I had seen this pattern before. I just hadn't wanted to admit it until now. By the 4th week the house felt different. Daniel's footsteps down the hall sounded louder. Sarah stopped knocking before entering my room. The grandkids suddenly didn't have time for me. Small ways of pushing me out built up until it was impossible to ignore. It started the morning I found my pill organizer in the wrong place. I always kept it in my nightstand drawer, but that day it sat open on the dresser. The Wednesday section was empty, even though I hadn't taken those pills yet. I didn't panic. I didn't accuse anyone. I threw them away and used the backup supply I kept hidden. After that, I never left my coffee unattended and I carried my important things with me at all times. One afternoon I overheard Daniel in the backyard, his voice sharp and angry on the phone. I caught words like property, combining assets, and legal guardianship. Later that day, Sarah asked me to sign papers for their house loan. She said it was just routine. But when I noticed my name listed as part owner on their second mortgage, I looked straight at her. She hesitated just long enough before saying it must have been a mistake by the bank. That pause told me everything. That night, I pulled out an envelope hidden under my suitcase lining. Inside were records from when my husband was alive, copies of my will, and a full list of everything I owned. Since his death, everything had been kept separate. Sarah and Daniel didn't know my name wasn't on their Oregon property. They thought I had only my savings and retirement funds. But the truth was I still had other investments spread across different banks. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't helpless. The next day I went quietly to the bank and asked to see the manager. I showed my ID and asked if anyone had tried to use my social security number. She found 3 failed attempts, coming from an IP address linked to Daniel's business. I asked her to place the highest security on everything. Face recognition, in-person changes only, voice confirmation. She didn't question me, she just did it. I made it home before dinner. Sarah had cooked chicken with soggy vegetables. Daniel asked about my day. I told him I'd gone to the park and fed the ducks. He nodded, satisfied. That night I barely slept, not from fear but because I knew something big was coming. And I was right. 3 days later I woke up to find my room torn apart. My suitcase unzipped, drawers pulled open, jacket pockets turned inside out. My hidden papers, gone. I stood in the doorway, heart pounding, then walked downstairs. Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee. She didn't look up. Daniel was leaning against the fridge, arms crossed. I asked if anyone had been in my room. Sarah said maybe one of the kids went looking for tape. Daniel added maybe I'd just misplaced something. Their answers came too fast, like they'd rehearsed. I didn't reply. Instead, I went upstairs, closed my door and pulled out the backup phone I'd hidden behind my books. The one my husband and I once used when dealing with a shady contractor. I called a number I hadn't dialed in years. My lawyer's assistant answered. I gave her the code word we'd set up long ago, and within minutes I was speaking with my attorney. He said he could lock down everything. I asked him to activate the safety plan in my will, remove any shared access to my accounts, and alert my offshore bank that someone was trying to steal from me. I also asked him to file a quiet report with Adult Protective Services, just to create a record. I wasn't accusing anyone yet, but I wanted a paper trail. Then I packed a small bag, just the basics. I didn't cry, didn't panic. I just acted. That evening as I came downstairs, Daniel stood by the fireplace holding my stolen papers. He didn't speak, but his smug face told me enough. Sarah stood behind him, unreadable. I told them I was going for a walk. They didn't stop me. At the corner I got into a black car waiting for me. My attorney had sent the driver. We went straight to a safe place I'd arranged years ago. A small apartment downtown in the name of an old friend who owed me a favor. The next day I froze all shared accounts, put fraud alerts on everything and moved my money into a protected trust. For the first time in weeks I slept without fear. Not deeply but with relief. The The quiet of that apartment wrapped around me like a blanket. For the first time in so long I could breathe. That night, I sat at the little kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, signing the stack of papers my lawyer brought. Each signature gave me a piece of my life back. Over the next 4 days I stayed hidden, curtains closed, phones off. I didn't watch TV or scroll social media. I just thought about how two people I once loved, Sarah and Daniel, had turned so cold. On the 5th morning I got an email from the bank. Someone had tried logging in with old information. Then another email from my lawyer. My trust was secured. The new setup couldn't be touched or altered. And my backup trustees, 2 women from my book club, both retired teachers, were officially in place. That same afternoon I spoke with an investigator at Adult Protective Services. I gave her everything. Incidents, documents, photos, a full timeline down to the hour. I wasn't pressing charges yet, but I wanted it all on record. She listened carefully. She didn't promise too much, but she told me something I hadn't heard in a long time. I had done the right thing and I wasn't alone. Later that evening I drove to my friend Linda's home. She welcomed me without questions, just a warm meal and a clean guest room. That night the full weight of betrayal hit me. It wasn't just about money. They had tried to erase my independence, to replace my choices with their control. But they failed. That truth kept me strong when the letter came. It was from a law firm representing Sarah and Daniel. Cold, businesslike. They said they were worried about my disappearance, wanted a meeting about a new estate plan, and hinted that I might be under someone's bad influence. They even mentioned my age, my supposed confusion. I handed the letter to my lawyer. He read it, smiled, and then marked up every manipulative phrase. His reply was polite but firm. He attached proof of my mental sharpness, recent medical evaluations, and laid out the full timeline I documented. He copied Adult Protective Services and the Federal Banking Commission. The very next day a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit called. The bank had flagged those login attempts as part of a larger pattern of elder abuse. Daniel's name had surfaced before. 2 days later I sat across a table from that detective. I told the detective everything, not just the facts but the subtle ways Sarah and Daniel had controlled me. How Sarah made quiet comments about my health. How Daniel used silence to push me into agreeing. Together they chipped away at my independence, disguising it as care. The detective took notes and asked if I'd testify if needed. I said yes. More than anything I asked for protection, for other women like me in the future. The next week I met with my attorney again. We prepared a formal statement, confidential unless charges moved forward. And for the first time it was clear, I hadn't overreacted. I wasn't imagining things. I'd seen the truth and responded the right way. That week I did something deeply meaningful. I changed the name of the charity fund I'd once started with my late husband. It had been tied to our wedding anniversary, but now I called it the Eleanor Foundation after my mother, the strongest woman I ever knew. From then on, a portion of its earnings would support women over 65 who had survived financial abuse by their own families. I didn't need revenge. I needed purpose. And with that change I felt peace. The anger was still there, but it no longer consumed me. By the end of the month I officially moved out. Linda helped me find a 1-bedroom condo in a quiet neighborhood with wide sidewalks and tall trees. I unpacked slowly, set up photos of my husband, and framed a copy of the trust certificate with my mother's name at the top. That evening I sipped tea by the window, watching the branches move in the wind. I had lost family, yes, but I had found something else. My own voice. My own strength. 2 weeks passed quietly. No social media, no unnecessary calls. I walked each morning at sunrise with nothing but the sound of my steps and the birds. Then came the letter. It was sent to my old address, but my lawyer had it redirected. Inside was a petition filed by Sarah and Daniel, asking family court to declare me incapable of managing my own money. They used the Elder Protection Act, claiming I was mentally unfit and isolated by outside influences. The cruelty was sharp, almost laughable. Attached were statements from 2 of their friends, people I'd barely met, describing my supposed memory lapses, even saying I'd asked the same question repeatedly at a family gathering. Ridiculous lies. But filed in court it became public record. I met with my attorney. He wasn't surprised. He laid out a plan. Calm, steady like always. We'd respond with documentation. My medical evaluations from Dr. Stevens, cognitive assessments and sworn statements from my financial advisor, 2 neighbors, and 3 members of the charity board I'd served on for 8 years. These people had known me far longer than Sarah and Daniel's planted witnesses. Then something unexpected happened. The detective called again. They had security footage, not from my bank but from Daniel's. 2 separate attempts to access accounts under my name, using altered documents. On their own, not enough for charges. But combined with everything else, it built a strong case. They were preparing to take it to the district attorney. That night, I sat with Linda and told her everything. She listened, then said something I hadn't considered. Write a letter to the court yourself. Not just legal papers. Speak as a woman. Let the judge hear your heart before they see your face. Took me a day, but then I sat down and wrote by hand, 5 pages. Not just facts but feelings. I wrote about my childhood, about raising Sarah, her curiosity as a child, her laughter. I wrote about the moment I realized she had changed, the silence between us that grew louder with time. And I explained simply, protecting myself wasn't cruel. It was necessary. And it had come almost too late. My attorney typed it up and added it to our response. The hearing was set for 3 weeks later. Those weeks passed in a strange stillness, not calm but waiting. I heard nothing from Sarah or Daniel. Not a word. But in a small city, word spread fast. The newspaper hinted at the court filing and old friends started calling. Most just left messages. I didn't call back. Not yet. On the morning of the hearing, I wore a black suit I hadn't touched since my husband's funeral. I combed my hair neatly and pinned it back. I carried no purse, only a folder with my name on it, and a heart that had learned not to be afraid. Courtrooms are colder than they look on TV. I sat beside my attorney, steady and ready. Sarah and Daniel sat across the courtroom with their lawyer. Sarah wouldn't meet my eyes. Daniel glanced once, then looked away. The judge entered and the hearing began. Their attorney spoke first, painting me as unstable and vulnerable, using words like isolated, withdrawn, emotionally compromised. Then came their 2 witnesses, repeating vague stories they'd barely witnessed themselves. When it was our turn, my attorney presented the medical evaluations, sworn statements, and the full timeline. He ended with my letter, placing it on the record. The judge read it silently, then looked up. She said it was rare to see such clarity from someone accused of incapacity. She dismissed the petition immediately, calling it groundless, even abusive of the legal process, and referred the matter for investigation. We walked out without looking at Sarah or Daniel. There was nothing left to say. Back home, I made tea and sat on my balcony for the first time. The sky was wide and pale blue. The air smelled of spring rain. Later, I got an email from a small women's advocacy group. Someone at the court had shared my letter. They asked if I would speak at their upcoming conference, not about the case but about resilience, reclaiming identity, and surviving quiet betrayals. I closed the laptop. I wasn't ready. But the thought stayed with me. Maybe healing wasn't about closure. Maybe it was about this. A quiet place, a name restored, a voice finally strong again. The week after the hearing, something shifted inside me. It wasn't relief exactly. It was quieter, like standing in an emptied house, carrying only the silence of what was gone. I had won, yes, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like walking away from war alone. That weekend, Linda stopped by with groceries and daffodils. I didn't talk much and she didn't push. She just sat with me while I watered plants and organized the kitchen. It was the first time I noticed how steady my hands had become. No shaking, no tension, just calm. That night, I opened the old memory box I'd brought from the house. Inside were photos, letters, and a wooden box of cards Daniel had once given me. His messy handwriting, silly jokes, promises to take care of me when I grew old. I held one card for a long time, then set it aside and opened my journal, the one with blank pages I hadn't written in since after my husband died. On a fresh page I wrote one sentence: I am still standing. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but it felt true. Thought. 3 days later I met my lawyer again, not out of necessity but to talk about what came next. He reminded me about the trust, about the Eleanor Foundation, and said the first round of grants could go out in 6 months. Applications were already coming in, women with stories of loss, survival, quiet rebuilding. Then he asked if I wanted to remain anonymous. I thought about it for a long time, what it means to be visible, for others to hold on to your name in their darkest hours. I told him no. I want my name on it. That evening I walked around the neighborhood. I passed a playground, swings painted yellow, children running in circles. I sat on a bench, let the afternoon sun warm my face and thought of Sarah. Not with anger, not even sadness, just acceptance. She had made her choices. I had made mine. And this time it wasn't about protecting what I had. It was about becoming who I wanted to be. Back home I made tea, then opened a blank document on my laptop. For the first time in years I began writing my story, not as a case, not as a complaint, but as a life. Imperfect, quiet, but mine. It began with the same words from my journal. I am still standing. And from there the words flowed like a river finally reaching the sea. 3 weeks after I chose to go public with my name on the Eleanor Foundation, a letter arrived. It was from a federal investigator's office, addressed directly to me. No lawyer, no bureaucracy, just a simple line at the bottom. They were reopening the investigation into Daniel. My fingers didn't shake when I set the letter down. I didn't feel fear, only a tightness in my chest that told me the past wasn't done with me yet. The next day I sat across from the investigator. The investigator looked younger than I expected, but her eyes were patient and kind. She explained that several suspicious financial transfers had been flagged in a wider elder abuse investigation, and 2 names kept showing up, Sarah and Daniel. I gave her what I had. But more importantly, I gave her what no one else could, the story behind the numbers. No anger, no rambling complaints, just facts. Clear and sharp as winter air. How Sarah had quietly gained access to my digital accounts. How Daniel pressured me to sign over power of attorney without time to think. How I once believed this was normal, even loving. She leaned forward. They had already pulled bank records tied to voice confirmations for wire transfers. In one, a man identified himself as my son-in-law, using my full name and social security number. But the voice wasn't mine, and the authorization had never been recorded properly. The wheels of justice were turning now, and for once I wasn't the only one who could see it. That night I sat in the dark with only the heater humming. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just felt it, that low hum of accountability. It didn't taste like revenge. It tasted like gravity, like things finally falling where they belonged. 2 days later Linda stopped by with a thick folder. Reports and recommendations from the Eleanor Foundation board. They wanted to expand. More applicants, more outreach, even a partnership with a community college program teaching women digital safety and personal finance. In the middle of the proposal was a note about a speaker series. Women over 60 sharing stories of rebuilding. They had penciled me in as the first speaker. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. That night I sat on the balcony in the heavy summer air, fire trucks passing a few blocks away. I thought about what it would mean to speak, not in whispers or journals but out loud. And not just for me but for hundreds of women who had already written to the foundation. Stories filled with disbelief, manipulation, betrayal disguised as love. My story wasn't unique. That was the hardest truth. It was common. And that silence had to be broken. So I agreed. 2 weeks later I spoke at a small gathering in the basement of the community center. Metal chairs, paper cups of coffee, no microphone. I told them the truth. Not every detail, just enough. I told them I was 68. That I had raised a daughter I loved with everything in me. That I watched her slip away, not in one dramatic moment, but in 100 small choices. I told them about Daniel's punch and the silence that followed. But mostly I spoke about waking up, about realizing survival wasn't the goal. Dignity was. That no inheritance, no blood relation, no shared history could outweigh the voice of a woman finally saying enough. There were no cheers. Just silence and a few tears. But that silence was different now. Not shame, recognition. Afterward, a 75-year-old woman named Dorothy took my hand. Her son had taken her home, maxed out her credit cards, then vanished. She had never told anyone until that night. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop talking. And I realized that this was the real legacy. Not the foundation, not even the court victory. It was the fact that somewhere in that room, a woman breathed easier because I had spoken first. By late summer, the Eleanor Foundation had begun spreading quietly through senior centers and women's groups. No flash, just steady growth. I hadn't planned for it to get big. But when you plant something honest, it grows. Next, I agreed to speak at a senior center in Salem, about an hour's drive from home. Simple flyers had been printed. My name, a time, and a title I hadn't chosen. finding your voice again." The words sat heavy with me the whole drive. The room was bright, coffee brewing, about 30 women seated in a circle. I wore a green cardigan, dark pants, and the gold bracelet Daniel had given me for my 65th birthday. Funny how I still wore it. Not for sentiment, just because it matched everything. When it was time, I hadn't practiced. I just stepped forward and told another version of the truth. This time I spoke more about what came after. What it felt like to sit in your own home without listening for footsteps. How to shop for one and not feel sorry for yourself. How to pay bills and feel grateful for the quiet beep of confirmation. As I spoke, I saw women nodding. One reached for tissues. Afterward, a silver-haired woman named Betty asked to walk me to my car. She was 72. Her story came slowly, but I knew the rhythm. A son who took over her finances, a daughter-in-law who managed all the paperwork, until suddenly she couldn't even touch her own savings. She whispered that she had no one else to tell. I gave her a number, not mine but the center's hotline, and told her to call in the morning. Trained volunteers would know what to do. She held that paper like it was a rope tossed to someone drowning. That night I couldn't sleep. Not from fear but from the weight of it all. Stories piling up like autumn leaves, each one rustling with the same pain. And for the first time I wondered if I was strong enough to keep holding space for them all. 2 mornings later I was making scrambled eggs when my lawyer called. The federal investigation had moved forward. Charges were being prepared: identity theft, elder abuse, financial coercion. Daniel's name was on the list. So was Sarah's. The news didn't shock me, but it still hurt. What caught me off guard was the media request. A national newspaper was preparing a feature on elder financial abuse and wanted to include the Eleanor Foundation. They asked if I'd go fully on record. I said I needed time. That afternoon I walked for hours through old neighborhoods, past the post office, the movie theater, even a coffee shop now selling organic smoothies and gluten-free pastries. The world had changed while I spent years just surviving it. But now I was living in it again. And maybe it was time to stop hiding. So I said yes. The article came out a week later. My name, my photo, standing outside the community center, sunlight catching the silver in my hair. The headline was simple: she found her voice. There were no angry calls from Sarah, no threatening letters from Daniel. Just silence. But this time it felt deserved. Then something unexpected. A young woman from Portland State reached out. She was studying social work, and her great-grandmother had been one of our first grant recipients. She said she cried when she read the acceptance letter, and she wanted to help other women feel that same hope. I told her yes. Not just because we needed volunteers, but because she was proof that what we were building wasn't about me. It was bigger. That afternoon, as I sorted grant applications, I realized something important. I hadn't thought about Sarah or Daniel in hours. Not with fear, not with pain. They were simply gone from my mind. And that, more than any court ruling or newspaper headline, felt like the real victory. A few days later, I came home from the farmer's market with tomatoes and sunflowers. On my doorstep was a thick cream-colored envelope, no return address, just my name in sharp handwriting I knew instantly: Sarah's. My hands didn't shake. I opened it right there on the porch. Inside was a short letter, 4 sentences. She said she'd seen the article, that Daniel admitted they had made serious mistakes, and she wanted to meet for lunch. Just a quiet meal. She named a restaurant downtown near the courthouse, suggested Saturday at noon. I folded the letter, went inside, and made iced tea. I didn't need time to decide. I wasn't going. But I didn't throw it away either. I left it on the counter by the fruit bowl, untouched, for 3 days. Maybe I wanted to understand why I wasn't angry anymore. Why the invitation didn't hurt. Why the quiet inside me felt so steady. By Saturday morning I had forgotten about it entirely. Only when the golden light of evening filled the room did I remember. Noon had come and gone. At 6:30 my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again and again. Finally I answered. It was a doctor at St. Mary's Hospital. Sarah had been admitted with chest pains. A mild heart attack, but serious enough for immediate treatment. They had found my number listed as her emergency contact. She had written my name down. I sat on the couch, phone pressed to my ear, frozen in place. I could hear the steady beep of machines in the background. For a moment the air felt thin. I asked the doctor if Sarah would be okay. He said yes, stable condition. Then he added that she'd been asking for me. She was alone, scared. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my hands, the veins showing, the age spots that hadn't always been there. I thought of the woman who had hit me, dragged me out of her house, made me feel invisible. And then I thought of the little girl who used to nap in my lap on Sundays, who cried over scraped knees, who stole chocolate chips while helping me bake. So I went. Not because I forgave her, but because I needed to see her as she was now, vulnerable, human. The hospital room was dim. She looked smaller than I remembered, hair loose and 4-line in her arm. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then she whispered my name. I pulled the visitor chair closer and sat. The nurse smiled softly and closed the door. We sat in silence until Sarah finally spoke. She said she had read everything, the articles, the interviews, the court documents. She admitted she hadn't realized how far she'd fallen, how much she'd changed. She claimed Daniel was the one always pushing harder, while she only wanted to protect what they'd built. I listened without comment. Then she asked something I hadn't expected: if I'd created the Eleanor Foundation to send her a message. I shook my head. I told her it was never about revenge. It was about learning to breathe again. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She said she couldn't undo what she had done, but she wanted to try, start over, not as mother and daughter, just as two people who once shared something real. I stood then slowly. I told her I didn't hate her, but I didn't belong to her anymore. My peace wasn't tied to her regret. Then I walked out. Outside, the sky had turned deep purple. Cars moved in and out of the lot. I breathed in, not relief but something deeper. I had looked into the eyes of the woman who tried to destroy me, and she no longer had power over my life. That night I made vegetable soup, not from hunger but because I wanted something warm. I lit a small candle, not for ceremony but for the comfort of its glow. And for the first time in many years I slept through the night. The next morning I brewed strong coffee and stood at the window. The mail carrier walked his route, steady as always. But this time he came to my door and handed me an envelope directly from the United States Attorney's Office. I sat at my table before opening it, my fingers calm, my heart steady. The letter confirmed what I had hoped. Federal charges were being filed against Daniel: wire fraud, coercion, elder abuse. Dates, filings, testimony, all listed. And my name appeared several times, not as a victim but as a key witness. But then came the part one didn't expect. The anonymous tip that had started the FBI inquiry months earlier had come from Sarah. The same woman who had dragged me by my hair. She had turned him in quietly, long before the hospital or the lunch invitation. She had done it alone. I didn't know if it was guilt, fear, or something else that drove her. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had dismantled the very structure she once helped build. I set the letter aside and glanced at the gardening magazines by the window. Fall was near. Time to plant bulbs. Maybe daffodils again, bright yellow against the dark earth. A week later, a federal agent came to my door. Plain clothes but a real badge. She said my testimony would move the case forward quickly. The agent told me Daniel had already been questioned. His attitude shifted the moment he learned Sarah had cooperated. There was no arrest yet, but the path of consequences was clear. When she left, I sat in silence for almost an hour. I didn't call or text anyone. I simply walked through my apartment, touching the surfaces of my table, the wooden handles of the drawers, the books on my shelf. These were the things they never managed to touch. The parts of my life they never stole. That night I turned on the radio. Not for music, just for the comfort of voices that didn't threaten or demand. Then I pulled out the notebook I'd been keeping since the week I left their house. I opened to a blank page and wrote, not about them but about me. My backbone. My quiet strength. My heartbeat when I walked barefoot through the apartment at dawn without fear. The slow return of self-respect after years buried under someone else's version of loyalty. I didn't need justice to look like handcuffs and sirens. I just needed them to know I had survived their betrayal, without permission, without apology. Later that evening the phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. It was Sarah. Her voice was thin. She said federal agents had come earlier, that Daniel packed 2 suitcases and drove away without goodbye. She said she didn't know where he went or if he'd return. Then she whispered she was sorry, but it didn't sound like an apology. It sounded like someone finally exhaling after years of holding her breath. I didn't call back. Instead, I stepped onto my balcony, sweater wrapped tight around my shoulders. I breathed in the cool, clean air and listened to the neighborhood settle. No shouting, no slammed doors, no one standing behind me. For the first time in a very long while, I was exactly where I chose to be. I smiled, not from triumph but from peace I had earned. 3 days later, another letter came from my attorney. I almost didn't open it. My mornings had become sacred. I drank coffee slowly, let the sun stretch across the floor without rushing. But the envelope was thick, heavier than usual. Inside was a copy of a legal document that made me sink into my chair. Months ago, before the confrontation, before the violence, I had signed a paper I barely remembered. Something Daniel had rushed through, printing forms on his computer. I thought I'd read carefully, but one slipped past me. It created a joint trust, attempting to transfer nearly $5 million from my investments to a holding company under Daniel's control. The transfer never went through, thanks to the security alerts my bank set after suspicious activity during my hospital stay. But my lawyer's review uncovered something worse. Sarah's name had been added to the trust. It would activate only if I were declared mentally incapacitated or upon my death. I stared at those papers, a chill running through me. My own daughter had signed documents that built her future on my absence. Daniel had drawn the blueprint, but she had agreed. And then came the final detail. In his own handwriting, my lawyer explained he had compared the dates of that trust against my unexplained fall at their house. The bruises, the dizziness, the medication I didn't remember taking. It all lined up. They hadn't been waiting for time to take me. They had been trying to incapacitate me, quietly, legally. They expected me to fall. They hadn't expected me to survive. Now the entire paper trail sat locked in my attorney's cabinet, time-stamped, undeniable. Evidence that made it impossible for them to claim ignorance. After reading the letter, I stepped outside into the sharp wind and let it ground me. I thought of the sacrifices I had made for Sarah when she was young. The dinners, the long nights working extra jobs, the life I carried alone after her father died. She had once been my joy, but now she had signed her name to papers planning my absence. Daniel orchestrated it all, but she had agreed. They underestimated me. I survived. And survival, I realized, isn't loud. It's quiet, steady, final. That Friday I walked into the federal courthouse alone. No ceremony, just marble floors and a clerk who nodded respectfully. The fraudulent trust was voided, the frozen funds returned, and my name fully restored. No applause but deep release. I sat outside with tea in the sun, warmth filling places fear had lived for too long. Later I planted tulips, flowers that pushed through frozen ground and bloom anyway. Daniel left me a voicemail. Sorry. Sarah wanted to talk. I deleted it. A photograph arrived of her as a teenager holding her baby. I didn't cry, but I didn't throw it away. I tucked it in a drawer with things that once mattered but no longer define me. I wasn't angry anymore. I had clarity. Peace. Months later, the Eleanor Foundation grew beyond what I'd imagined. Universities, hospitals, even a national conference invited me to speak. I told them the truth. Abuse within families is common, silent, devastating, and survivors are often the strongest people you'll ever meet. Applause rose like understanding itself. New laws followed, new clinics, new hope. At our first gala, Dorothy, the woman who once whispered her story of losing everything, stood tall and shared how she had rebuilt her life. She looked at me and said, "Thank you for going first." That was victory. Not punishment for them, but restoration for us. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you feel like it, share your story in the comments.